ladies and gentlemen. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Welcome to Transmissions from Jonestown. You're listening to Episode 6, Apostolic Socialism. As the dust settles on Jonestown and the years go by, mountains of evidence grow to insurmountable heights. As researchers and scholars ascend, the proverbial peak remains lost in a haze, growing ever higher. 40 years later, the tragedy in Jonestown, with its high-resolution images of mass carnage and over 40,000 pages of FBI documents, paints a gruesome picture of nonsensical events. Anyone who has researched the subject well can tell you, once you get over the shock of how something like Jonestown can happen and try to understand why, the web of mystery and intrigue woven between the white noise of global politics inevitably becomes a black hole. There are just too many questions. Was Jim Jones working for the CIA? Why did it take 4 days to remove bodies from Jonestown? Why were only a handful of autopsies performed on the remains? What was Jim Jones doing in Cuba? Who sent the message over the radio using a secret CIA channel? How many bodies had puncture wounds from forced injection? How did Jim Jones get the monkeys to sell in Indiana as a teenager? The drugs to Jim Jones and the clinic in Jonestown? Ties between Jonestown and Project MK Ultra?
Attention. Excuse the fact, please, that I've been up several nights and days fighting this horrible conspiracy with our wonderful attorney. It's staggering to the imagination. I'm very sorry also that I have a laryngitic voice that makes for unpleasant listening. Anyway, the socialist revolution in all countries and under all countries. Revolution in the countries and under the countries of all the countries and under the countries and under the various struggles and number of circumstances, no matter what method they use. Anyway, Guyana is standing by fully the struggle for liberation. We cannot be grateful enough to live in a country. It ought to inspire us to great work to help produce a great nation who gives so much of her limited resources to other nations resisting oppression. Needless to say, my lack of sleep for now going on the 4th day. I know you're not accustomed to hearing my voice in this fashion. It's just one of those days. And as all of you know, I sure don't drink. And I oppose drugs with every sinew and fiber in my bone.
To continue on our quest to understand what happened in Jonestown, I invite you to follow me down the rabbit hole. I would like to thank our anonymous contributors whom without their unique and often colorful voices and opinions, this episode would not be possible. Not everything you hear can be verified as fact, but I encourage you to research these theories for yourself and make up your own mind. Many of these theories do not in any way reflect my own feelings about the People's Temple or what happened November 18, 1978, but all are worth mentioning. Cobbled together out of intelligence agencies left over from World War II, the CIA was created to fight communism using the military in covert operations and to collect intelligence on hostile foreign governments. As Berlin was split in half and the USSR developed the bomb, the rise of communism emboldened the CIA to spread its surveillance to every continent and plant agents in every government. For nearly 40 years, America focused its military might on the Cold War. Through assassinations and espionage, the CIA did its share to ensure American superiority over Russia. Corrupted by its xenophobic inception, the agency ruined countries with impunity and waged secret wars unchecked.
Follow the money. After the reconstruction of Western Europe, Allen Dulles, the first head of the Central Intelligence Agency, whom I must mention worked on Wall Street, drafted a plan that allowed the agency to conduct secret political wars while making millions of dollars under the nose of Congress. Dulles made sure that the CIA didn't need federal money to fund foreign militias. They controlled drug trafficking in East Asia and later in South America. They grew the drugs, sold the drugs, and that money went on to fund political uprisings and terrorism. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, it's all about the opium, who was allowed to grow it and who was allowed to sell it. Under the Central Intelligence Agency Act of 1949, the Director of Central Intelligence is the only federal government employee who could spend unvouchered government money. That's right, an organization that could spend over $40 billion a year doesn't have to keep receipts. Unconstrained by a congressional budget, not even the president knew what these guys were about. Yet a pattern emerges. Every time a small country like Cuba decides to fight for its independence or to nationalize its resources, the CIA gets involved. They always say it's the Red Scare. They are fighting communists to protect America from a nuclear winter. While everyone is playing duck and cover safe in their suburban homes, the CIA is playing chess with Iran and beginning their MKUltra mind control programs. Wherever American business interests are threatened by the nationalization of foreign industry or the redistribution of wealth in poor countries, the CIA is there to put a stop to it, usually by installing a right-wing dictator into power by whatever means necessary. Tyrants who rule by fear have a high success rate in maintaining martial law, destroying labor unions, and wiping out special interest groups. More importantly, they are marvelously corrupt, eager for whatever power or payoff comes their way. Unfortunately, dictators have never been easy to control long term. In the 1970s, you really start to see the CIA's glass houses begin to crack. Papa Doc in Haiti butchering people in the streets with machetes, the starvation of the Congo, Laos, and Cambodia bombed into oblivion. They just couldn't hide their mistakes anymore. People knew the CIA was running things. After Vietnam, it was clear to the American people that the fight against communism at the cost of our morality would no longer be tolerated. People started to put together the pieces and realized that the CIA was working for big business, for the Rockefellers and the pharmaceutical companies.
An attempt to rein in CIA spending by Congress and the anti-war movement threatened the autonomy of the agency. When the CIA was investigated after the Watergate scandal, domestic covert activities such as MKUltra, illegal surveillance of civil rights groups, and human rights violations prompted the House and Senate to begin regulating and monitoring the agency more closely. In 1974, an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act was introduced that would require the CIA to disclose in advance plans for overseas covert operations to Congress. The legislation would limit the amount of covert ops happening without the president's knowledge, as well as curtail rogue spending happening in the name of national security. This amendment was called the Hughes-Ryan Act, named for its co-authors Harold E. Hughes and Leo Ryan. Shortly after Leo Ryan was killed in Port Kaituma, the Hughes-Ryan Amendment was severely watered down, giving the CIA back its autonomy.
A decade before Leo Ryan went to Jonestown, he fought against the establishment. Ryan stood for prison reform and even went undercover after the Watts riots to help black people gain equal rights and blew the whistle on corrupt urban developments. The CIA killed Congressman Ryan on the tarmac in Port Kaituma. If you watch the footage of the assassination, you can see that the sharpshooters in the truck are dressed in fatigues. They attack in a military formation and execute their targets one by one. Even on the so-called death tape, Jim Jones states twice that he didn't order the assassination of the congressman.
One of those people on that plane is gonna shoot the pilot. I know that. I didn't plan it, but I know it's gonna happen. Are you gonna separate yourself from whoever shot the congressman? I don't know who shot him.
The government killed him because he worked for transparency in the Central Intelligence Agency, just like John F. Kennedy. The Hughes-Ryan Amendment literally ripped funding out from under the CIA. It was like Kennedy's screw-up in the Bay of Pigs all over again. Mark Lane, the attorney for the People's Temple, was in Jonestown when it all went down. He literally wrote the book on the CIA's involvement in the assassination of JFK. They probably planned to kill him on the tarmac too, but there wasn't enough room in the truck leaving Jonestown for Port Kaituma. He said that Green Berets were stationed in Matthews Ridge after he and Charles Geary escaped Jonestown and were hiding in the jungle. Mark Lane said he heard several rounds of machine gun fire and people cheering.
Mark Lane was in the Army Intelligence from 1945 to 1947, helping to denazify Germany after the war. He was heavily involved in the intelligence community, as was Richard Dwyer. The message that was sent over the radio on a secret CIA channel the night everybody drank the Kool-Aid could have easily been sent by Mark Lane rather than Richard Dwyer. Mark Lane joined the CIA from its meager beginnings and was deeply undercover working as a civil rights lawyer, sabotaging counterculture movements from the inside. At the same time Mark Lane was the attorney for Jim Jones, he was also representing James Earl Ray, the guy who supposedly shot Martin Luther King. Grace Walden Stevens witnessed the assassination of Martin Luther King, but the FBI didn't want her testimony at the trial. She had seen the man who'd shot Martin Luther King and claimed it was not James Earl Ray. The FBI put her in an insane asylum and she was lost in the system for years. Mark Lane pulled some strings and got her out. He wanted her to testify at an appeals hearing on James Earl Ray's behalf. Terry Buford, a member of People's Temple's staff, was living with Mark Lane at the time and helped hide Grace Stevens until the hearing. After the mass suicides in Jonestown, Grace Stevens disappeared and her testimony was never used in James Earl Ray's defense. In the aftermath of Jonestown, notes written by Jones and others were found. They talked about moving Grace Stevens to Jonestown using a passport that belonged to a People's Temple member that had mysteriously died 2 years earlier. Nobody knows if Grace Stevens ever got to Jonestown, but if she did, she certainly didn't survive. Coincidentally, journalist Don Harris was the only network newsman in Memphis covering the story and interviewing key witnesses when Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was in Leo Ryan's party and was shot and killed during the assault on Port Kaituma.
Like I've said all these years, they've got the wrong man. When they went back to see Mrs. Walden, who was kept in mental hospitals conveniently all that time. Just the other day, in an unprecedented news conference, religious leaders of Memphis, joined by black civil rights leaders from throughout the country, demanded the immediate release of Grace Walden and a trial for James Earl Ray. When Grace Walden was finally cleared and said she was mentally competent, now she's finally been called mentally competent. And her last interview this week was, before the interview began, she was given psychiatric drugs again, trying to keep her confused Yet through the drugs and the manipulated interview came her simple and clear message. Like I've said all these years, they've got the wrong man. James Earl Ray was not the man who came out of that bathroom 10 years ago. That's how much of a conspiracy you've got in the USA.
Jim Jones had originally wanted to create his promised land in Grenada. Jones met with the Prime Minister, Sir Eric Gairy, and invested $200,000 of People's Temple money into Grenada banks, $76,000 of which was still in the bank after the mass suicide. Despite this, Jones had to settle on a 25-year lease in Guyana signed by Paula Adams and arranged for by George Philip Blakey in 1974. The agreement with Guyana's Prime Minister Burnham was that Jonestown would be a productive agricultural community and help stabilize the region. The land Jonestown was built on is part of a border dispute that has existed between Guyana and Venezuela for over 100 years. The Orinoco Valley is rich in gold, uranium, and bauxite, an El Dorado for large mining companies. There is also speculation on large oil deposits being investigated in the late 70s in the disputed territory. It was decided that a settlement of American citizens would create a sort of tripwire so that if any attempt was made by Venezuela to seize the valley, the American government would be forced to intervene in order to save 1,000 American lives. Racial tension in Guyana traces all the way back to the original Dutch colonies. The Dutch put the Amerindians of Guyana to work in the tobacco fields, severely decimating the indigenous population with diseases introduced by European settlers. Eventually, they transported thousands of African slaves to Guyana to work the sugar plantations. As the population of Guyana grew, violent slave uprisings sprang up, causing white flight. Over half of the European settlers left. Eventually, the British moved in. Slavery was abolished by the 1840s, and the newly freed slaves moved away from the plantations and began small villages and farms. The British imported thousands of indentured servants from India to work the sugar plantations, filling the void left by the emancipation. The economic struggles in Guyana, though clearly the fault of imperialist foreign governments, often created racial tension between the East Indian and Afro-Guyanese population. Under British rule, the Constitution favored white planters, making it even tougher for Afro-Guyanese farmers. After World War I, life in Guyana was beginning to change as the first labor union was formed. By the end of World War II, Guyana was fighting for its independence. Chetty Yagan, as part of the People's Progressive Party, won the election in Guyana in 1957. He was a Marxist socialist working closely with labor unions and fighting against colonialism. His leftist leanings made the British nervous. Yagan was educated in the United States and married an American woman. He wanted to nationalize Guyana's resources for its people and build much-needed infrastructure throughout the country to improve the quality of life in Guyana. He spoke out against the Rockefellers for destroying burgeoning governments that attempted to nationalize their resources and crawl out from under the oppressive boot of colonial rule. The Rockefellers were deeply invested in Guyana's mining industry. Now on the brink of independence from Britain, Yagan went to President John F. Kennedy to ask for support of Guyana's independence and financial aid from world banks to help build highways and power stations. Kennedy's reaction to Chetty Yagan shaped the rest of the Cold War.
Kennedy didn't like that Yagan was trading with Cuba and feared that he would hand the country over to Russia, so he ordered the Central Intelligence Agency to intervene. In Guyana, a rash of fake news on suspicious new radio stations reported that Cuban ships were fast approaching. Lies and propaganda were printed in the newspaper, and the capital of Guyana, Georgetown, went up in flames. A campaign against Chetty Yagan and the PPP had begun. From 1961 to 64, the head of CIA operations in Guyana was Agent Frank Wisner, a veteran of the previous covert operations that overthrew Guatemalan President Jacoby Arbenz and Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran. The CIA used the opposition party in Guyana, the People's National Congress, led by Afro-Guyanese leader Forbes Burnham, to disrupt the economy and participate in race riots. Chetty Yagan was Indo-Guyanese. It's interesting to mention here that sometime in the early 60s, Jim Jones was in Georgetown, Guyana, making anti-communist speeches against the Yagan government shortly before he went to Brazil on what is widely considered to be his CIA-funded odyssey into South America. Later, Forbes Burnham would negotiate leasing the land for Jonestown with the People's Temple, as Jonestown was built not on public land, but Forbes Burnham's family estate. The head of the PNC, Forbes Burnham, had at one time fought alongside Chetty Yagan in Guyana's struggle for independence. After working his way up through the ranks of the PPP, Burnham formed his own right-wing political party, the PNC, a primarily Afro-Guyanese organization that focused on the rights of black farmers and trade with foreign governments. He was also the head of the labor union, making it easy for him to cause labor strikes and disrupt commerce in order to smear the PPP government. The PNC was CIA-funded and encouraged to disrupt life in Guyana with violence and chaos. Forbes Burnham is a controversial figure in Guyana. Educated in London, he began his career working for the equal rights of Afro-Guyanese in colonial Guyana. But from 61 to 64, Burnham used every dirty trick in the book to create racial tensions between the Indian and African populations of Guyana. His militias took to the streets, destroying thousands of homes and flooding the press with propaganda. He was a CIA puppet. The National Security Council approved over $2 million for covert operations in Guyana from 62 to 68. This money went directly to the PNC and the United Force, a small CIA-run political party supporting Portuguese business interests in Guyana. In 1964, the PNC successfully rigged the election using Burnham's intimidation tactics and British absentee ballots. Forbes Burnham came to power, essentially now in debt to the United States government. All ties with Cuba or other communist nations were severed. The CIA had Burnham in their pocket. During the next several elections, the PNC depended on foreign aid coming from the United States to lock down the elections and fund its silent war against dissenters. One of Burnham's favorite ways to rig an election was by using overseas absentee ballots. He faked thousands of overseas votes, as was proven in the 80s, and proxied thousands more, a tactic also used by the People's Temple in San Francisco. Election fraud is something the People's Temple was good at, as was the PNC. Prime Minister Burnham ruled the country like a dictator. United States and British business interests were protected regardless of the environmental or economic consequences for Guyana. It became a narco-state with strong ties to crime deep within the American prison system. The U.S. Embassy in Guyana was run by the CIA. Every employee was working intelligence, keeping tabs on the Burnham government. The corruption and violence caused a mass exodus of wealthy Guyanese leaving the country in the hands of Burnham's death squads and an army of mercenaries, the Guyana Defense Force. For decades, Burnham increased racial tension and bled the country dry of its resources. Guyana borrowed so much from world banks during his reign, it essentially became a rental state.
Guyana is open, absolutely the only nation left that's open to real colonization, because they have fewer inhabitants than they do fertile ground. It's a perfect place to settle, and it's so vital that we show our love for others in the struggle, that we always have this place. If anyone gets in difficulty in the struggle, there's no extradition. They can't be sent back, so that we have this haven for them. So let us all show our love, our gratitude, our appreciation by work. Thank you very much.
It isn't clear exactly how long the CIA was financing Forbes Burnham and the PNC. Once he had aligned the Guyanese government in his favor and controlled the military, he started showing his communist colors again. He traded with Cuba on the sly, even imported Cubans to arm and train the Guyana Defense Force. He severed all ties with the United Kingdom once and for all and turned Guyana into a smuggler's paradise, complete with money launderers and guerrilla fighters. Burnham hired assassins from the House of Israel to kill his political adversaries. Guyana became a totalitarian state.
Come on, comrades, come on, come on! So that the leader can see those faces, those happy faces, those PNC faces.
Last week, Mr. Burnham went to the polls again. Since 1968, Forbes Burnham has become a considerable statesman among leaders of the Third World, who recently conferred in Guyana. He talks the language of black power.
Let me hear you give a cheer for the comrade leader as he comes on. Louder than that, comrades, louder!
Though helped to power by America's CIA, Mr. Burnham has recently taken a sharp left turn to establish links with Russia, Cuba, and China and nationalize some foreign-owned industry. But unfortunately for the Prime Minister, this international success has not removed his problem of winning votes in Guyana.
It is not for me to tell you in which direction a bright future lies. It would be, on my part, an imposition on your intelligence to tell you which of the political parties can offer you the future which you want and the future which you deserve.
Was Jim Jones aware of the corruption in the Guyanese government, or that it was essentially a puppet state run by a dictator working for the CIA? If so, why would a faith healer, a con man, a socialist revolutionary, move his commune into the lion's den, closer than ever to the very government forces he rallied against and feared?
It is important to keep the support to this type of Fabian democratic cooperative government. If there is this alleged internal or external subversion done by such agencies as the CIA, if it is true, we do not know, but that is the common apprehension here, and it's in the press so much. Let it be stopped. This government is following a course of non-alignment, democratic cooperative stance, and support of free enterprise. Indeed, they're nationalizing. That's the wave of the future. Of course they're doing that. But if there is this continued apprehension, you're only going to force people by necessity with alignment to those who are more radically inspired, and to the left who would be more in contact with those forces of a totalitarian nature. This country, I read and I contact many, and there is absolutely no truth. They are non-aligned. They treat Americans here, United States citizens, beautifully. They believe in a cooperative form of democratic government. They are non-aligned, and no way, in any way, do they have troops, Vietnamese, stupid, ridiculous charges, or Cubans based here to subvert other nations surrounding them. It's absolutely false.
Many controversial religious sects sought refuge and isolation under Burnham's government in Guyana. The Church of Kali, the Seventh-day Adventists, and even Obia, a kind of voodoo church. Burnham's newly independent government opened its doors to disenfranchised churches and misunderstood left-wing militants. In return, some of these groups aided in rigging elections and even assassinated members of the opposition parties. One of Burnham's strongest allies in his struggle to maintain power was the House of Israel and their leader, Rabbi Edward Emanuel Washington, aka David Hill. David Hill grew up in the United States singing in a traveling minstrel show. As an adult, he was involved in the civil rights movement, supposedly driving a bus through the front window of a diner in order to integrate their lunch counter. After a short stint in prison, Hill went to the South to help register African American voters. There he attacked a white supremacist with an axe and found himself imprisoned again. While in prison, David Hill claimed to have had a spiritual awakening when he was introduced to Judaism. After prison, he spent some time in the state mental hospital and then headed to Chicago, where he started his church, the House of Israel. Though not officially ordained, he called himself Rabbi Hill, preaching that all Africans were the original chosen people of God, and the writings of Karl Marx. In Chicago, Hill set up several temples and became involved in the Black Panther movement through his associations with Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. By 1974, Rabbi Hill had temples in Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. He started a campaign in Cleveland against the fast food chain restaurant McDonald's, claiming that they refused to sell franchises to black people. Rabbi Hill petitioned his followers and leaders from the civil rights community to donate money for the purpose of buying out 9 McDonald's franchises.
Rabbi Hill swindled thousands of dollars out of the black communities he supposedly supported. After raising the money to purchase the McDonald's franchises, he was brought up on 9 counts of extortion. Hill bailed himself out and disappeared for a couple of years to Algiers in Africa. In 1971, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison, but by then he was hiding in Guyana under a name taken from a fake passport, Edward E. Washington. Forbes Burnham refused to extradite him back to the United States, so Rabbi Hill was indebted to him.
The parallels between Rabbi Hill and Jim Jones' civil rights-oriented beginnings and their ability to con their followers out of house and home is uncanny. Yet there's more. In 1972, Rabbi Hill leased several thousand acres of land in Guyana, directly from Forbes Burnham. There he built an agricultural settlement, a socialist promised land where his followers could be free from racism and religious oppression, not 50 miles away from Jonestown. Rabbi Hill boasted a fellowship of 8,000 followers throughout Guyana. Unlike Jonestown, the Hilltown settlement successfully produced food and was heavily armed. Rabbi Hill did not rely on importing disenfranchised Americans to build his fellowship. Rather, he converted Afro-Guyanese farmers and recruited young men from Georgetown. As Jim Jones proclaimed himself a living God, Rabbi Hill claimed to be the Messiah Elijah, come to earth to free his people and give them the miraculous powers to rule the world. He spread the word of socialism and black supremacy throughout Guyana, alienating the Indian and indigenous population. To this day in Guyana, the children sing nursery rhymes about the rabbi and his strange followers. Hill ruled over his people with an iron fist, compulsively enforcing communal law, economically controlling his flock, and requiring acts of social dissidence and violence as a show of loyalty.
Forbes Burnham used the House of Israel like the Pinkertons. They violently broke up PPP rallies and caused massive labor strikes that unseated Chetty Yagan. They stockpiled weapons and held sway over the Guyana Defense Force. Rabbi Hill was an excellent con man with ties to militias in Africa. His settlement was better armed than the Guyanese army.
Rabbi Hill worked for the CIA. The House of Israel was a convenient way for the United States to launder money legally into the PNC government. Hill bought government bonds with no expectation of ever getting a dime back. Hilltown trained guerrilla fighters later sent to support the American invasion of Grenada and trained assassins for hit squads. The CIA was using Guyana as a testing ground for extreme black supremacist organizations and their effects on dictatorships.
How did you think you were going to get out of here? They've all been alerted. No boat would dare pick you up. It's been a violation of law. All the canoes. Anybody got any questions to ask these assholes that have taken all of our workforce today, spread out, got the Guyana Defense Force alerted, the Coast Guard alerted, the Border Patrol alerted, the Prime Minister's secret police alerted. Anybody have any? Minister of Agriculture alerted, and the Deputy Prime Minister alerted, and the Commissioner of Police alerted, and the Kaituma Police alerted, and the Matthews Ridge Police alerted, and the GNS alerted. If you picked up by jail, speaking against this country, speaking against black, speaking against socialism, going to Venezuela, did you bother to tell him about the cat o' nine tails? Why didn't you tell him about the cat o' nine tails? To speak subversion against this country, to leave parent and home, to violate law and be out after curfew, you'd be eligible for 39 stripes with a cat o' nine tails. I don't really know what's come off with you idiots that you couldn't have more sense than this. Just how did you expect to get out of this country, you say? You on the river? This is goddamn proof that Mao knew what he was talking. That there's only one way to change people. It's out of the barrel of a gun.
The House of Israel, as history teaches us, did in fact assassinate a Catholic priest and members of the Working People's Alliance, an opposition group in Guyana. After the deaths in Jonestown, Hilltown briefly came under scrutiny by the American press. Rabbi Hill was interviewed about the parallels between his sect and the People's Temple. In his grand palace in Georgetown, he would distinguish his organization by pointing out the House of Israel's military might and the influence he had over the Guyanese government. According to Rabbi Hill, he needed Guyana, and they needed him.
Jim Jones tried desperately to appease Burnham and make good on his agreement to provide resources. Jonestown failed at growing food or producing any marketable resources. They had few guns and no military training. The population of Jonestown was mostly elderly and young children, so they couldn't exactly set the world on fire or disrupt political processes as People's Temple once had in the U.S. Jones was certainly aware of Hilltown and the power of Rabbi Hill. Jones makes vague references to Hilltown on the tapes in the Jonestown audio library.
Anyone coming near wherever my abode is, don't get in front of my door, pull on my handle, or my window. Don't touch my window. You might find yourself in a lot of trouble. It's meant only for mercenaries or somebody else that wants to come and start some shit with me or the children. You understand what I'm saying?
He was afraid they would steal the children or try to assassinate him. The FBI considered pushing for the extradition of Rabbi Hill in 1978. The concerned relatives, with their constant petitions to the Guyanese government, drew attention to the PPP's dependence on the House of Israel. By now, Burnham already had doubts about Jonestown. When news that a United States congressman was going to be poking around Guyanese domestic affairs, Burnham was furious. The CIA disliked the direction Burnham's dictatorship was heading in. Due to its socialist sympathies, Guyana was in jeopardy of losing its financial backing from the United States.
When Congressman Leo Ryan was assassinated, 2 GDF soldiers watched from the far end of the airstrip. Rather than intervene, they dropped their machine guns and ran into the jungle.
Western told me there were 2 GDF guns.
They saw it happen and ran in the bush and dropped their machine guns. I never in my life.
I believe they ran to Hilltown and reported to Rabbi Hill that crazy white people from Jonestown had just killed a United States congressman. You can hear on the death tape that Jim Jones wasn't worried about the American government parachuting in and killing everyone. It was the GDF he was frightened of.
Please get us some medication. It's simple, there's no convulsions with it, it's just simple, just please get it. Before it's too late, the GDF will be here. I tell you, get moving, get moving, get moving.
During the mass suicide, Jones is frantically rushing everyone to hurry up and die so that he and his closest followers can make it to the Russian embassy, collect their $700,000, and escape into one of the People's Temple boats, never to be seen again. Rabbi Hill sent his death squad into Jonestown after the congressman was killed. When they arrived, all but 100 of Jones' followers were dead from cyanide poisoning. The survivors were stacking bodies in rows. The death squad attacked the survivors and, under the orders of Forbes Burnham through Rabbi Hill, slaughtered those that were left, including Jim Jones, as he sat on his throne. They looted Jonestown, as was evident when U.S. forces arrived to clean up the site. The House of Israel had interrupted an act of such depravity no one could be allowed to leave the scene alive, or worse, escape. For 2 days, they manipulated the evidence in Jonestown before reporters arrived. After the remains from Jonestown were removed, the House of Israel was allowed to take anything of value from the settlement. After Jonestown, Guyana lost its financial backing from the United States, the House of Israel rioted at the American embassy, causing its closure for several days. To this day, it's experiencing blowback from the mass suicide debacle.
The economic harm done to Guyana by Burnham's dictatorship is felt to this day. Forbes Burnham held on to his power until his death in 1985 following throat surgery. He is celebrated in Guyana as a folk hero who stood for Afro-Guyanese equality. His legacy lives on, fueling the modern political climate in Georgetown. A land so untouched and rich in resources, it had inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, and was believed to hide in its jungles the golden city of El Dorado, is today laid waste by overmining, corruption, and violence. What treasure had once been hidden in the Northwest Territories of Guyana are now considered long gone. Burnham was a ruthless dictator. He exploited his people and destroyed the environment. After Burnham's death, the House of Israel was vulnerable to prosecution. Rabbi Hill was imprisoned for several years. Upon release, Hill moved to Newark, New Jersey, where he remained until his death in 2001. Of the supposedly 8,000 followers of the House of Israel, little is known as to their whereabouts. In 1974, Martin Luther King's mother, Alberta King, sat playing the organ for a congregation in the Ebenezer Baptist Church. The last few years had been hard for Alberta, losing both of her preacher sons to untimely deaths. She played the Lord's Prayer to a crowd of 400 worshipers. In the audience sat a 23-year-old Marcus Wayne Chenault. As the people bowed their heads in prayer, Chenault stood, raising 2 pistols in the air, and yelled, "I'm taking over here." He started shooting towards the pulpit, hitting 4 people and killing Alberta King. Chenault grinned, looking around, asking if he had shot anyone. When asked why he did it, Chenault claimed to be the Hebrew servant Jacob, on a mission to kill black Christians.
When Chenault was going to Ohio State University, he fell in with a group called the Troop, a militarized black supremacist group run by Rabbi Emanuel Israel, yet another moniker for Rabbi Hill. The day Chenault killed Martin Luther King's mother, the House of Israel dropped him off at the church and handed him the guns. Chenault claimed that Rabbi Israel had been mentoring him and several others, preparing them to assassinate important African Americans in the church. He was brainwashed by the House of Israel. They wanted to start a race war in America.
Spanish explorers had a saying about Guyana's Northwest Territory: "He who goes to the Orinoco and doesn't die comes back mad." Now, imagine what it must have been like to be one of Jonestown's first settlers. Having grown up navigating the urban sprawl of Southern California, nothing prepared you for the intense isolation of Guyana's Northwest Territory. In the jungle on the edge of Jonestown's newly constructed boundary, a terrifying new sound announces the coming of dusk. As the sun retreats behind the dense canopy, the sound of one becomes many, rising to a chorus of screaming, tortured souls. The Promised Land held many surprises for these American newcomers. Guyanese howler monkeys included. Guyana has a strange and dark history. Despite its wealth of resources and luxury exports like gold and sugar, the people have remained relatively poor, and most of the country lives without electricity. Fairy tales of jumbies, Guyana's version of demons or zombies, are told to this day. Popular among these myths is the story of the Dutchman tree. Sometime during the 1500s in Guyana's early colonial days, the Dutch were mining huge amounts of gold from the rivers and mountains. The gold was so plentiful, one mountain yielded a legendary single nugget weighing over 42 pounds. After a mine was tapped out, it took time to move all of the gold through the dense jungle into the ships bound for Europe, so the Dutch would bury the gold to be moved a little at a time. Legend has it that the slaves used to mine the gold were murdered by their Dutch masters and buried so that their spirits could become jumbies, who would then guard the treasure. There are trees the Guyanese still refer to as Dutchman trees that are imbued with the jumpy spirit of old Dutch slave masters. They believe that fruit from the tree will poison you, or that the tree itself can kill you. At one time, Jim Jones claimed he was able to raise the dead. Legend has it that he performed miracles and healings for the Indians that lived in the jungle, but they didn't react as poor folk from Indiana once had. The Indians thought he was a demon capable of dark magic and was unsettling the delicate balance of spirits that lived in the jungle.
Say, yes, please, Reverence. Perhaps you need to hear. Sometimes I think you need to hear what I hear. Spirit that is speaking to me, I energize you. I give you energy now to speak with an audible voice what I'm hearing in my ear. As you spoke in the original to Paul, a voice came. As you appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, I say, Spirit that's in that lost world, speak with an audible voice. Louder. Louder. Open your eyes. You're speaking in Russian. You're saying, forgive me, be not angry. I forgive you. We are in America. In this incarnation, we're in America. Speak English. Help me. What? In Galilee? I'm not sure it was distinguishable to them, but you're saying you betrayed me in 1917? Yes. What do you wish me to do for you, child? You need a body. Clasp your hands. As it was on the day when I gave a double portion of the Elisha spirit, a part of the spirit, there's someone here that this soul belongs to. You're not integrated, and that's why you're having trouble in your mind. I will not call you out. Close your eyes now, I ask you. I speak the word, and perhaps when it comes, that spirit comes out of the ether plane and comes into its body and integrates, there will be, no doubt, some gasping. So be very quiet. As I, Lenin, Jesus, Buddha the Bab, God Almighty, I free that spirit from the loneliness of that nether world and integrate it in its body here. disintegrated.
Thank you.
Nobody talks about the giant meat pit they dug underground in Jonestown. When they first built the camp, they wanted to raise cattle and pigs, but didn't have any refrigeration, so they dug a massive trench. When they miscounted bodies in Jonestown and said they found 200 people, then 400, then 700, it was because so many of the bodies were laying underground in that trench, mostly kids. The People's Temple sucked at farming. They epically failed at raising livestock. So as people began to die off in Jonestown, they put them underground to keep and ate the meat. Eventually they started killing visitors for meat. Hey, they had to eat.
And I tell you, I didn't intend for you to get into this shit, but I knew one thing, we had to be true. I tried to give you peace. I tried to give you peace and security. But you sure didn't have no peace there, and you didn't have anything to live for or die for. Peace. Peace. It is a lot of these folks are scared. Locals are scared. The people, the old adage of the agricultural syndrome being connected with slavery, they occupied around the cities. All these soldiers are scared shitless of that jungle. They're scared of snakes, and most of us are not. The few that are, will eat them and the snakes. Do you agree with that? Carl Burnett, combined Manhattan Pavilion. We've got the first one to cook. Hell, we've been through it. We shot them and we ate them the other time around. And that's how the fucking truth. Go on, honey. Okay. Everybody thought they had, some thought they had beef, some thought they had chicken, some thought they had fish. What's that? Freeze dry. I knew he had teeth, yeah. One sister kind of bothered her when the tooth was in the soup. Because the one sister said, I didn't mind taking that soup. She said, but when that eye bobbed up and looked at her. Ah, shit on you, hypocrites. You're already with a bunch of cannibals, so fuck you.
Possibly the strangest bit of trivia about Guyana is that it has the highest suicide rate per capita in the world. 40% of the people who commit suicide in Guyana do so by consuming agricultural chemicals. Some sources theorize that the high rate of suicide is due to the constant spraying of pesticides in rural areas that, when ingested, cause people to become depressed and despondent. Others say it's because of the unusually high rate of HIV in the country. This statistic excludes the suicides at Jonestown because they were American citizens. The tragedy in Jonestown wasn't the first mass suicide in Guyana. The Cucanon Valley is located on the very edge of Guyana at the tri-border where Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana meet. There, Mount Roraima, with its monolithic 4,000-foot cliffs and enormous waterfall, is a spiritual center for indigenous tribes on all sides of the border. In Venezuela, they called it the House of the Gods, with its impossible-to-climb summit and strange geometric cliff face. But in Guyana, the Amerindians have a very different name for it: Suicide Mountain.
In the early 19th century, two German explorers, Richard and Robert Schaumburg, were hired by the Royal Geographic Society in London to embark on an expedition across Guyana. To guide them on their excursions into the jungle, they hired an English-speaking Indian guide named Awakaipu. The Schaumburg's expedition was successful. Having collected many flora and fauna, they safely returned to Europe, grateful to Awakaipu for his indispensable knowledge and protection throughout the journey. The time Awakaipu had spent with the German explorers had given him aspirations of grandeur, and after their departure, Awakaipu declared himself the leader of all the Indian tribes. He sent word throughout the land for all the tribes to meet at the foot of Mount Roraima, where he promised to perform miracles and teach the Indians how to become rich and powerful like the white men who stole their land. The tribes were instructed to make peace and meet at the beginning of the dry season. They were told to bring gifts for Awakaipu, and in return, they would receive magical items. Thousands assembled at the foot of Mount Roraima, offering weapons, fish, and precious gunpowder. In return, Awakaipu gave them old pieces of newspaper from the London Times. The Schaumburgs used the newspaper to press flower specimens and had left them behind. Now Awakaipu presented the paper as a magical charm of great power. The Indians, having never seen newspaper before, hoarded it as if it were gold. Awakaipu and his followers built a settlement at the foot of the mountain and called it Bekaranta, meaning land of the whites. Awakaipu now only dressed in ritual garments, hiding all but his eyes, and encouraged his followers to drink kasiri, the toxic byproduct of the cassava plant said to create a zombie-like state when ingested. He lived in his 2-story jungle hut with a harem of women. Awakaipu let the old gods take control of his body and would prophesize the coming of the white man and the destruction of his community. One night, a spirit called Makanaima spoke through Awakaipu, warning the Indians that if they didn't change the color of their skin to white, all the tribes would be wiped from the face of the earth. He told them that if they killed themselves at this moment, their souls would rise to the summit of Mount Roraima and be reborn in 2 days with white skin and all of the knowledge of man, giving them the power to rule over all of Guyana. Awakaipu grabbed a club and hit a man in the crowd, smashing his head open and drinking his blood from a kasiri gourd. His followers went crazy, fighting amongst each other, tearing each other apart. No woman or child was spared as the violence raged on until morning. The next day, Awakaipu and a handful of surviving followers waited at the bottom of the mountain for the resurrection of the fallen. For 2 weeks they waited, and not one of the over 400 slain came down from the mountain. Now believing Awakaipu was a con man, the Indians stormed his jungle palace and tore him apart. From that day forward, Mount Roraima was called Suicide Mountain by the Amerindians of Guyana. 100 years later, travelers in the Kukanum Valley reported seeing Amerindians guarding precious lockets and amulets, housing tiny pieces of old London Times newspaper.
There is a mysterious and legendary history of mass suicide in Guyana. Maybe it's the unique electromagnetic frequency that emanates from its mountains, or maybe it has something to do with the massive uranium and gold deposits creating a sort of death-fueled tabernacle. Something about that place causes entire groups of people to commit suicide in almost ritual fashion. Sometime in the late 17th century, the Vatican sent a mission of Capuchin monks to the wilds of Guyana to spread the Christian faith among the savages living in the jungle. The monks, cut off from the outside world, succumbed to starvation and disease and were nearly wiped out by the time they reached the Orinoco Valley. Spanish tales of cities of gold and fountains of youth galvanized the monks, and they were obligated to never turn back. Ghostly people hidden in the trees rained down poison arrows and burned their camps to cinders. Lost in the swamplands and dying of dysentery, the monks made camp at the foot of Suicide Mountain. For days, they prayed to God to deliver the natives into their spiritual care and show the monks the way to El Dorado. As they perished, one by one, they went insane. The natives watched as the remaining Capuchin monks lit themselves on fire at the foot of the mountain, committing suicide in the Valley of Death. On the next episode of Transmissions from Jonestown.
Does your churches have any love? Does your preacher talking about the sky god? Will he give you a ride?
I belong to an ancient trade union of spiritual teachers exploring without the pressure of time and space.
Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. Some were unethical, not only by today's standards, but by the standards of the time in which they were conducted.
How do we define love? You have to share. You have to think of your brother or your sister above yourself. You give your life and then you find it. Complete self-death. Lose your life in service to others.
The Attention Span Recovery Project would like to thank the Jonestown Institute and the anonymous contributors. If you have any questions or comments about this program, you can contact us at radiojonestown@gmail.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Radio Jonestown. End transmission.
The people and now you know how it feels. Goody, goody, you lied and lied, but the truth has been revealed. Goody, goody, you should have given your best, the way the world gave to you, but you tried to